or all these other games, Ocarina of Time, and I don't ever hear like a Gran Turismo really. Why? Because it's a racing game, or some people if they're cultured in gaming, they'll say Shadow of the Colossus. You know what I'm saying? Um, but Sony made Shadow of the Colossus. They made Ico. They made the Jack and Daxter series, which people consider that to be generic. But then they like Mario 64, maybe because that was the first one. I don't know. They made the Getaway. You know what I mean? Which was one of the first games that didn't have a HUD and stuff like that. Or there's just a Monster Hunt, not Monster Hunter. Ghost Hunter. They had that game. They had that one in there. What other games that they have that I can think of? For the PS3, they had obviously Uncharted series, the Last of Us series. You had the Killzone series. You had Starhawk and Warhawk. You had Infamous. You had God of War. And I never really hear those games pop up. I don't really hear them. The only thing I hear is like if they are considered a fan, what they'll do is they'll say it's like they're ashamed to say that they have a Sony favorite. You know what I mean? Like unless it's unanimously chosen to be a favorite, then it's like, okay, now I got the okay to say, this is it. And I just feel like that's a travesty. If you're a gamer, you shouldn't be afraid of what is your favorite game of all time. Regardless of what it is. Like my favorite game of all time, which is a tie between these things, will be it'll be Sonic 2, the first Tomb Raider, and Shadow of the Colossus. All three of those are like equal to my favorite game of all time, which isn't necessarily tied to a platform except for Shadow of the Colossus. But you don't. It's like most of the gamers are so fixated on review scores that they don't. That they literally will be like, yeah. What was the highest review score for Sony? Is The Last of Us Part Two? I mean, Last of Us Part One, Uncharted Two. Yeah. That's my favorite game of all time. It was just so good, and to be honest with you, mechanically, they were the most simple games out of all the games that Sony has made. Even Jack and Daxter was more complex than the Uncharted games. You know what I'm saying? And then I'll talk about I'll go back to The Witcher versus uh, the what do you call it? Horizon. And all you hear is that the melee wasn't that good. Um, the combat really wasn't that good. The game can become boring. It wasn't really an RPG, and it is exacerbated when you have the Forbidden West. Like people just tend to just completely forget. Like it's so wild to me, and my jaw drops every time I hear this shit. My jaw absolutely drops because it doesn't make any sense to me. I had two friends recommend The Witcher, and one thing I could say that the strength of The Witcher is the story for sure. And their side quests are definitely, they have a good flow of side quests, a very good flow. But when it comes to the gameplay, the menu system is convoluted. It is crap. It is crap of a menu system. I don't know what's going on. It's like you need to know how to, use a PC to understand their menu systems. And even if you did understand the menu system, the gameplay is really clunky. They got a lock-on feature, and when Geralt spins his sword around, he's flying all over the place. The camera gets all caught up. It's very laggy. The animations are stiff. You know what I mean? Unless it's a motion capture animation, like him vaulting over like a waist-high thing. It's like very or an execution. It is very stiff. His dodge is very stiff. He just kind of leans forward and slides. And then I'll hear this from the fans of The Witcher, and they will literally just completely ignore all these things and say that the general consensus, I will say this, is that the combat is okay. But when you hear fans of The Witcher, they're like, oh my God, it's so good. Especially some of them say it was the best RPG they've ever played, and that's the standard. And I'm like, what the fuck? And then they have the audacity to talk about when it comes to melee systems, they talk about Horizon, and Horizon is a bad melee system. Like, bitch, they got combos and they got counters and stuff like that. No, they don't have a block, but like really, the block really made you feel like it's shittier. The animations are a world apart. And then I'm looking at people play for Spoken too, right? This is another grind I got. I mean, a gear that I have to grind, right? And I feel like maybe what's happening here is that, and I said this in another video I've done before. Um, I think what's happening when it comes to people is that the culture of um, the actual culture of gaming is set. And to me, it's like if you're a Japanese developer, you get a hard pass, when it comes to like faulty or average gameplay, as long as it has like flair and style that is of anime. That's when it's like, oh, they can do whatever the hell they want, you know. They can have like poor graphics, you know what I'm saying? They can have poor animations and skip frames and shit like that, and it's automatically fucking cool because it's like a Japanese developer. And as soon as a Western developer does their own thing, then it's like average at best. It doesn't make any sense to me when I'm reading these things. It's like, what am I reading here? Going to Forspoken, people are trying out new combat techniques and and really trying to learn the mechanics of the game. But then when they play Horizon, all they use is one bow, and then say that the game is dry and the game is like it's weak in combat and I can't kill the enemy. But yet when you play Forspoken, you want to mix and match spells. Like, newsflash for you, right? You want to know something that's very curious? The technology that is in Horizon, such as the bombs, which are the explosions, or the acid, or the plasma, that's nothing but magic reskinned. And the game is very, very deep when it comes to mechanics. It is extremely deep when it comes to mechanics in terms of what they're trying to do with it, or what they have accomplished actually with the game. You have a system that you have an element called Purge Water, which stops special attacks like fire or ice or any kind of like electric attacks. It makes them just physical attacks, right? And the enemy becomes drenched and more susceptible to either ice or electricity. Depending on what the enemy is actually, or the machine is actually weak to, you could then, right, apply electric. If they weren't really weak to it, if they're in this purged state or the water drenched state, then you can crack that threshold for that enemy and make them become weak, which shock actually stuns the enemy and they can't move, and you can do more attacks or whatever you want to do with it. Or you can freeze them, which doubles your damage. And you get stuff like that, and people literally just stick with a basic arrow. It is ludicrous to me that people will look at a PlayStation game and be like, yo, the mechanics are not that great, but at least the story is, and at least the graphics are. So I'm just going to stick with that. As long as it has a good story, that's all I care about, and hopefully it gets a good score. And I'm only going to pick these games with a good story and good graphics. And I just want to blow through this game, and I'm not even going to like really do research on the technology. Like, what? Get the fuck out of here, yo. Y'all don't have any problem with any other game, especially if it's Japanese. But when it's another game, y'all don't want to explore the mechanics at all. And then you want to sit there and say that The Last of Us is one of the best games of all time, and Uncharted 2 is one of the best games of all time, and all you're doing is pew pew and follow the corridor and follow the yellow fucking climb the handholds. Really? Right. When you ask people what are the top 5 games of all time, it's barely any PlayStation games, despite the fact that Sony was in the game for almost 30 years. You know what I mean? They'll mention like a Resident Evil 4 or Ocarina of Time or a Final Fantasy 7 or things of that nature, you know what I'm saying? And or Halo even, you know what I'm saying? Or Mass Effect, and it's like no one ever really mentions PlayStation games. So 2 issues. The first issue is that I don't think even to this day people take Sony's mechanics seriously. I don't think that they take it seriously. I think that they think that Sony is like a one-trick pony. You know what I mean? And that all they do is narratives, and that the gameplay was always lacking. And I don't know whose fault is that, but I don't hear people talking about, because remember, you had Omega Boost, you had Gran Turismo, you had Ico, you had Shadow of the Colossus, you had the Jack and Dexter series, you had Ratchet and Clank, you had the Sly Cooper, you had Infamous, you had The Last of Us, you had Uncharted, you had Killzone, the God of War series, you know what I'm saying? And it's like all these games, and I barely hear about it. It's like the question here is, can Sony, match up with the greats? That's my question.
All right. I guess to rebuttal that, right, and not to go into like statistics or who you hear this from in the forums, when people do mention, like, let's just use the top 5, right? The top 5 best games of all time. What do you usually hear? Or like, it doesn't have to be consistent top 5, but what are the games that you consistently hear that are like the best of all time?
Metal Gear Solid, Ocarina of Time, The Last of Us, Uncharted 2, Halo.
Wait, so sorry. You mean outside of Sony or within, like?
I mean, like, the question here is, can Sony hang with the greats with their games? That's the question.
Oh, I mean, I guess I'm trying to figure out what's the bar for what the greats are. You know what I mean?
I don't know what the bars are. I'm just reporting what they said.
Like for me, right? Like for me personally, I think the best video game of all time is World of Warcraft. But I'm biased in that because I have a lot of
Well, you're a gamer. You're a gamer, so.
Huh?
You're a gamer, so I mean, like, you're an actual gamer.
I consider myself a casual, but you know, at the end of the day, like, I feel like if I'm gonna say, like, in terms of like, so like, I think the issue like today and asking that question is because now I think people are more brand aware of things, like not even just video games, but just like in music, just in terms of like where certain artists are signed to, where your clothes is being manufactured. Like consumers are just way more conscious, and I think back then, right, like when Sony was originally like, I think the platform to play games at, no one was thinking like, did Sony make this first or not? So I think for like a lot of people, if you ask the general population, like if I ask my homegirl right now, and I'm like, you want to play Crash Bandicoot? She's gonna be like, yeah, let me go get a PlayStation. She's not gonna think, oh, that's like an Xbox exclusive or something. So I think like PlayStation kind of being like the biggest platform at its like peak, and still is like right now, right? But just kind of being like that household name and brand, people are not necessarily thinking, oh, does PlayStation have exclusives? People are just thinking, I could buy a PlayStation, I could play anything, you know? But I definitely think PlayStation could certainly compete with the greats, especially within the last couple of years. Like, I've talked to people who, like, they're not really gamers, but they've heard of Uncharted, they've heard of The Last of Us, they've heard of the God of Wars. Like, they hear of these games from Sony, but I don't think, like, if you're talking about, like, competing, like, amongst gamers, like, maybe, I don't know, it's a lot more critical because we're all playing the games and we're paying attention to brands and stuff, but if you're just talking about, like, general public and just what people are just going to buy when they go to the store, whatever the case may be, I think Sony is going to be fine, personally. Like, I think once you penetrate outside of, like, your little niche, like, gamer realm, and you could penetrate pop culture and you could just get the masses, and Sony has done that very well, they'll always compete.
All right, so Jemiah, what's going on, bro?
What's up?
So, what do you? I know you're listening to this. So, what is your take on this? Because I feel like, in let's say 20 years from now, are these games that everyone says is the great? Is it going to even be respected? You know what I mean? As like people are still mentioning Ocarina of Time, people are still mentioning, Resident Evil 4 and stuff like that. Does it have that kind of staying power?
I mean, I guess, like, you can't really compete with nostalgia. You can't compete with games that came out when we were kids. Because they hold the biggest place in our hearts, you know what I mean? So people don't think of old games. And the biggest problem with Sony is a lot of their games back in the day were like Sony exclusives by default, you know what I mean? Because other systems weren't capable of doing it, you know? So like with the 64 and shit and the PS1 came out, a lot of those games like GTA 3 and shit, they're just default, de facto Sony exclusives just because of the hardware, you know what I mean? So,
well, I'm talking about actual in-house made games.
That's what I'm saying. So like, as far as like people naming games from back then, like most of those games were third party, so Sony never really had a huge first party back in the day. So of course people are gonna name a bunch of different games. Nowadays, I don't know if these games will stand the test of time. You know what I mean? Like, can you say that The Last of Us 1 will still be like one of the greatest games ever in 10, 20 years? I mean, maybe not. You get what I'm saying?
Well, I get what you're saying, and it makes sense when you say that, and it's part of it is nostalgia, but then you look at it, and like you said, you can't beat nostalgia, but I think people associate Sony with Naughty Dog only as if the other games don't exist. When they did PS3, man, they did a whole bunch of fucking games that were really fucking great.
I'm not gonna lie to you, bro. I think a lot of people associate a lot of those third parties with Sony now. Like
that's what I'm saying.
You did a Spaces like a month or so ago where you're like, who's the mascot for PlayStation, right? I think if you ask anyone, like the general population, it probably would have been like Crash Bandicoot or Lara Croft, right? But we know those are not. We as gamers know those are not Sony IPs anymore. But because that was the console back in the day, and that's like the household name, I think.
But I'm talking about now, like right now, the types of games, because like they hit their stride with. I shouldn't say hit their stride, but they started building their legacy with PS3.
Yeah, and I think it's gonna be a time will tell kind of thing. Like the kids really like Fortnite right now, right? So that might be like the game that's still talked about in the next 20 years, or like the Overwatch, or whatever the case may be. But you really can't say we're not like we're not 9 or 10 years old playing like The Last of Us Part 1 or Last of Us Part 2 to really have that like, okay.
But we are gamers, and
our nostalgia area is over already. Like, so in 20 years when we look back, we might not even be able to remember shit, you know what I mean? like we're gonna be old as fuck. So like the kids nowadays, they're gonna remember like, look at one time in Fortnite I did this, or that one time in Call of Duty I did that, or Madden. They're not gonna remember like playing like fucking God of War, Ragnarok. Like how many kids are actually playing and beating these games? You know what I mean? Mostly grown ass, not like us.
So let me ask you this. So let me ask.
It's also a little harder too, because the kids these days, like in terms of like new IPs, like trying to be remembered. Now everyone's competing. Like it's not just games competing with games, right? Like kids can go on TikTok, kids can go on Netflix. They can do other things instead of just like play gaming console, and so much more accessible. So I think overall the impact that games will just have on the next generation is like there will be more gamers, but it'd be less of an impact just because you could kind of split up your time and just like how you want to enjoy stuff. Like back when we did it, if you had a console, you had a console. If you had a computer, you had a computer, and that's what you were on. Now you just need like an iPhone, and you could do, you could be on social media, or you could be like on a game cloud and be playing a game. Like your attention time is split. But
my whole thing is this though. This is what I'm saying. What nostalgia cuts off at a certain age? Is that the revelation that I'm hearing right now? Like, because what's going to happen is like the 9-year-olds and 10 years old, right? They're forever going to remember what do you call it? Fortnite and Minecraft and what's that game, Among Us, and that's going to be their favorite game of all time. And it's like the older you get, you can't even like fucking like the older you get, right? You become disenchanted with every fucking thing. You know what I mean?
PlayStation